here is something no one explains properly. You might have noticed the grand railway stations, the architectural masterpieces that once defined the skyline of cities across the world. They seem like relics of a different era. But here's the thing. Why did so many of them disappear without a trace, almost as if they never existed? The official story is neat, but when we look closer, we start to see something odd, something that doesn't quite add up.
Officially, old train stations were considered symbols of progress during the Industrial Age. They were designed to handle the rapidly growing demand for transportation, connecting cities, regions, and even countries. Cities like New York, London, Paris, and Berlin boasted these vast, grandiose stations. The materials were carefully chosen: marble, steel, glass. It was an era where engineering and aesthetics went hand in hand. And yet, as rail travel declined in the mid-20th century, many of these stations were either demolished or repurposed. No big mystery, they just became outdated.
But what if there was more to this? Why were some of the most remarkable stations destroyed just as they were becoming part of the city's identity? Take, for example, the original Penn Station in New York. Destroyed in 1963 despite being an architectural gem. But that's just one of many. What was the real reason behind these disappearances? Let's widen the lens for a moment. In fact, this phenomenon wasn't isolated. Around the same time across the world, grand railway stations, not just in New York, but also in London, Berlin, Paris, and even Moscow, started disappearing. Some were burned down, others torn apart, and some mysteriously modernized into something almost unrecognizable. This wasn't gradual. It happened almost simultaneously across multiple continents. Why? In Paris, the Gare d'Orsay, an iconic structure from 1900, was transformed into a museum, losing much of its original grandeur. The same pattern can be seen in Berlin with the demolition of its majestic terminus, or in London, where the iconic Euston Station was completely rebuilt, erasing any trace of its past. Not to mention the destruction of the magnificent New York Penn Station. And this trend wasn't just confined to Western cities. Even in Moscow, the grandeur of old stations seemed to vanish. Why such a widespread change? Here's where it gets even more interesting. In each of these stations, there's one striking feature. Almost all of them were built with an incredible attention to detail, incorporating massive arches, large glass windows, and sometimes even elements that seemed ahead of their time. There was a sense of power and control embedded in their design. But why was this element so widespread? Why were these structures built with such a focus on energy, light, and space? Was there something more to them than just their function as transportation hubs? Now let's take a closer look at the science behind this. These old stations weren't just about trains. They were engineered to let in vast amounts of natural light. Their ceilings were often designed to capture energy, and the scale of the structures was meant to create a sense of awe. In some cases, the use of certain materials hinted at a more profound understanding of acoustics and energy flow. Could these elements have had a purpose that went beyond mere aesthetics and functionality? Could there have been an energy design embedded into these buildings, one that we've forgotten or neglected? Let's zoom out a bit. This wasn't simply about outdated infrastructure being replaced by modern systems. No, the old train stations were part of a much larger system, one that was systematically dismantled. The grand design of these stations, with their open spaces and large structures, may have represented something different. The new world was moving toward smaller, more confined spaces, and there was a shift in how cities were designed. Could this be a sign of a deliberate transition from a world of openness to one of control and restriction? And who exactly benefited from this destruction? Who stood to gain from the demolition of these grand structures?
Could it be that certain economic forces or political entities were looking to reshape cities, to shift from the grand ideals of public infrastructure to something more controlled and less public? Perhaps the answer lies in the realignment of the economy and power, away from public ownership and toward corporate control. As the railroads were replaced by highways, who got the contracts to build those new systems? Who profited from these new, smaller, more efficient designs? And here's where it gets even more speculative. What if the destruction of these stations wasn't just about economics or urban development? What if it was part of a larger, deeper cultural shift? Some have suggested that this could be linked to the rise of a global system, one that sought to replace older forms of knowledge and power with a new order. Could the grand stations have been connected to something much older, something we've lost track of? Is it possible that the systems that created these structures were part of a forgotten knowledge, one that was deliberately erased in the shift to the modern world?